Good evening, everybody, and a massive thank you for joining us at the Economic Research Council. A warm welcome to today's session. We're very honoured to have Professor Stephen Millard with us today. He'll start with a roughly 30-minute presentation, followed by a roughly 30-minute Q&A session. And as we're going through the talk, we really encourage you to engage actively, so please do submit any of your questions using the Q&A function just at the bottom of the screen, please. Before we continue, I'd just like to highlight the next event in our calendar. On the 16th of April, we'll be joined by Jonathan Portes, who is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London, and he'll draw on his recent research to analyse some of the unintended consequences of the post-Brexit migration system. We're looking forward to that one. Tickets are available now, so please do visit our website to secure your place and find out more about our other events. So, as I said, it's a real privilege to introduce Professor Stephen Millard, and we're really glad he can join us today. Previously, he was one of our titans in our previous Clash of Titans forecasting competition, so welcome back. He's the Deputy Director for Macroeconomics Modelling and Forecasting at the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and he's held a number of policy analyst and research positions at the Bank of England, stretching over 26 years. So, without any ado, it's with great anticipation that I welcome Professor Stephen Millard.
Thank you very much, David, and many thanks to the Economic Research Council for inviting me to give this talk. I'm actually quite excited already about the next talk from Jonathan Portes. I might just sign up for that as soon as I finish speaking, because I think that should be very good. Hopefully, I will be just as good. We shall see. Anyway, today's topic is modelling unemployment. This is something that I've been doing that kind of really got me into economics. So I was a teenager in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, we saw a massive increase in unemployment from something around 750,000 to 3.5 million in just a few years. And, you know, seeing that level of worklessness around me, it sort of really inspired me to do economics, to try and understand what causes unemployment, and to hopefully work somewhere where I could do something about it. Well, I managed to get the first of those. I spent a lot of my professional career thinking about the causes of unemployment and how it's best modeled. And today's talk really is trying to get some of that across to you. So this is the roadmap for today. I'm going to start with talking about theory of unemployment as it was in the 1920s and 30s. And I've raised a little pun here. Mr. Keynes and the Classics is a very famous economics paper from the 1930s. And essentially, the start of my talk will be a summary of the views in that paper. I'll then move you forward about 40 years to the development of search and matching theory. And this is actually where I come in, because I was doing my PhD at Northwestern in the early 1990s. And this was when we were developing search and matching theory that I will show later in the talk. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the UK labour market post-COVID, hopefully applying some of what we learned from search and matching theory in helping us to understand what's been going on. And then I'm going to close with NIESR's thoughts, I should say, rather than mine, on the outlook for the coming years for the labour market. I should say I closed all of these slides before this morning's labour market data, but given nothing moved very much on the month, today's data really doesn't affect the talk. So let's start with Keynesian and classical views on unemployment, at least as summarized in the famous paper, Mr. Keynes and the Classics by John Hicks. Because this paper was famous for giving us the ISLM model. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just going to talk about what he had to say about unemployment. So the classical view of unemployment is relatively easy to sum up. The labour market is just a market. And as we know from A-level economics or first-year undergraduate, markets clear where supply equals demand. So I've illustrated this with a diagram here. The blue line is the labor demand curve. The pink line is the labor supply curve. We have a market clearing real wage, and we have a market clearing level of employment. And the first thing to note is there's no unemployment in this model. The amount of labor supplied, H star, is exactly the amount of labor that people want to supply given the real wage, W star. So in essence, there's nobody who would want to supply any more labor given the current wage. Of course, you might say, well, if wages were to increase, then more people would have jobs. And that's true because, well, I mean, if the demand was there for them, that would be true because more people would want to supply their labor at a higher wage. But given the wage that it is, the market clearing one, there's no unemployment. If nobody wants to supply more labor than they are. But of course, this really doesn't make sense. We see unemployment in the world, and when Keynes was writing his general theory, he saw a lot of unemployment. This was the time of the Great Depression. So, what was the classical response? Why, how can we explain unemployment in our simple market clearing model? Well, the answer is it must be that the labor market isn't clearing. And it isn't clearing because the real wage is too high, and for whatever reason, it's not falling back to the equilibrium wage that would clear the market. So the real wage is high. This means that firms only demand this amount of labor. Workers, on the other hand, want to supply this amount of labor, and the gap is unemployment. I should say at this point as well that I'm being very fast and loose in talking about labor supply and unemployment. I've labeled this axis employment, but we could think of this as being total hours. It's a combination of, do you want to work at all? And then if you want to work, how many hours do you want to work for? And thinking about this as total hours, and this is the difference between the total number of hours that people will be willing to supply versus the total number of hours that are demanded. And that could be, you could have nobody actually unemployed, but everybody working shorter hours than they want to. Or you could have lots of people unemployed, and those people who are working the hours they want to. So really, this isn't a model of unemployment as such. This is a model of the supply of hours worked, if you like. So Keynes challenged this idea. He started with, okay, here is the wage, and he was thinking nominal wages. Given that wage and the amount of demand in the economy, and the amount of demand in the economy affects this blue line, then we have this amount of labor that's effectively demanded. There's this other concept here called full employment. And now we're really thinking in terms of workers. Actually, how many workers are out there versus how many are actually working, how many are demanded. And the gap between the two is unemployment. So Keynes's answer was not that wages should come down, it's that demand needs to increase. In the model, firms set price as a markup over marginal cost, and that marginal cost is dominated by wages. And so what he thought of, you think of this labor demand curve really as being a price setting curve. This says, given the nominal wage and the effective labor demand, this tells you what price firms set at. But the bottom line is still the same. Wages are higher than market clearing, but it's not. Unemployment is not being caused by wages being too high, it's caused by a lack of demand in the economy. And Keynes went on to say, even if we could reduce nominal wages, then what would happen? Well, firms' costs would go down. They're setting their prices, markup on costs, so prices would fall as well. So nominal wages fall, prices fall, real wages are unchanged. Real wages are not falling. So the idea that you can reduce unemployment by pushing down on real wages is just wrong in Keynes's view. In his view, the answer is more demand. So that was where we were until really the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when three people started developing search and matching theory. And those three people were honored with the 2010 Nobel Prize in Economics. They were Peter Diamond, Dale Mortensen, and Sir Chris Pissarides. My role in all of this was as a mere research assistant to Dale Mortensen. He came up with all the ideas, and indeed the model and the algebra and all of that. I just programmed it into MATLAB. But what are the key areas? What are the key ideas here in search and matching theory? Well, the first thing is we are going to be very clear in how we define unemployment. Unemployment in the data is defined as those workers who are currently searching for jobs, but who haven't found one, can't find one at the prevailing wage. They want one at the prevailing wage, but they can't get a job. And the reason they can't get a job is because, these things, they just take time. It takes time for firms to find the workers that they need. It takes time for workers to find jobs. So given that that is the real world, then maybe that's what we should model. We should model unemployment by taking explicit account of the fact that firms need to invest effort in recruiting workers, and workers need to invest time and effort in finding jobs. And these are what are called matching frictions in the labor market. Okay, so apologies for those people who don't like maths. There's only going to be a very, very small amount of it, I promise. The key thing in search and matching models is a constant returns to scale matching function. So this is what it looks like in maths. What does that actually mean? It means suppose I have U unemployed workers and I have V vacancies at the start of a period, say. By the end of that period, we will have M new matches formed, MT new matches formed. So of those U workers, M of them will find a job. Of the V vacancies, M of them will find a worker. What does constant returns to scale mean? It means suppose I double the number of unemployed workers, I double the number of vacancies, I'll double the number of matches. And you can get a long way understanding unemployment just by looking at this matching function. The first thing we can do is we can work out the probability that a job will find a worker. Well, that's simply going to be the total number of matches, M, divided by the number of vacant jobs, V. Okay? And that in itself is going to be some function of the ratio of vacancies to unemployed workers. And I'm just going to call that ratio theta, theta t. The more vacancies there are for every unemployed worker, the harder it is for any individual vacancy to match up with the worker. We can do it the other way around as well. We can ask ourselves, what's the probability that a worker finds a job? It's M divided by U, which turns out to equal theta times Q of theta. And again, here we go. The logic is the more vacancies there are per worker, the tighter the labor market, the easier it is for a worker to find a job. So we can go a little bit further in this model. We can calculate something we call the natural rate of unemployment. So this was defined in a famous speech by Milton Friedman in 1969 as being, what would the rate of unemployment be if you ground through all of your general equilibrium equations, but took into account the fact that there are frictions in the labor market. Now, in search and matching theory, it's very easy to define this. We just define this as being what the unemployment rate is when the number of people becoming unemployed each period equals the number of people leaving unemployment each period. So U star times theta. So theta, Q of theta, again, this is the probability that an unemployed worker finds a job. Multiply that by the number of unemployed workers, and that's the unemployment outflow. I'm just normalizing here the labor force. I'm going to set to 1. So 1 minus the number of unemployed workers. That's going to be employment. If I multiply that by the proportion of employed workers who lose their job every period, delta, then this is the unemployment inflow. This is the number of people becoming unemployed every period. So where unemployment inflows equal unemployment outflows, that gives me the natural rate of unemployment, the steady state equilibrium rate of unemployment. Now, that relationship can actually be plotted as a downward sloping relationship between vacancies and unemployment. And this is known as the Beveridge curve, after William Beveridge, who first suggested that there was this relationship here. And this is what the Beveridge curve looked like in the UK in the 2000s. You can see the downward sloping relationship between vacancies and unemployment. Now, if I add the 2010s, there's signs that it shifted out just a little, but not much, really. We're still on the same, well, that's the same downward sloping relationship. Then in the 2020s, something really strange happened. The Beveridge curve has become a kind of a straight line up. We'll come back to that. So back to the theory. Now, I like diagrams again. So here's a good way of doing it. What we're doing is we're plotting the real wage against labor market tightness. So the first condition is what I call the job creation condition. This says that the higher real wage is, the fewer vacancies firms are going to put out there. Okay, so higher wages. You can almost think of this as a labor demand equation, but instead of it being telling me how many workers are actually going to get employed, it's telling me how many vacancies for every unemployed worker the firms want to put out there. That's the job creation condition. The other thing here, we have what's called a wage curve, and that is named after a book by Benny Blanchflower and Andy Oswald. And what they said was there's this wonderful relationship between the unemployment rate and the real wage. Well, in search and matching theory, it's actually labor market tightness. What's the relationship saying here? It's saying, well, okay, the tighter is the labor market, the higher is the wage that I'm going to be able to command, because the easier it is for me to say to an employer, look, if you don't pay me a higher wage, I'm going to walk away. If the labor market is tight, I can do that because I can easily then go and find another job. So this is real wage labor market tightness space. Another way of looking at this model is to go back to vacancy unemployment space. The Beveridge curve we've already talked about. And then we have a straight line here, which just, given labor market tightness as it is now, theta, the straight line is the one whose angle here, sorry, the tangent of this angle is theta. Basically, this is a straight line, which depends on market tightness. This is the Beveridge curve, and your equilibrium vacancy and unemployment rates will be there and there. And that is the search and matching model. It's very simple. We can look at the effect of a productivity shock in this model. Higher productivity, it encourages firms they want to recruit workers. Workers are now more productive, so firms want to recruit more, so they post more vacancies. We have a shift outwards in the job creation condition. At the same time, for a given level of labour market tightness, you would expect to see workers bargaining for higher real wages. They're more productive, they should be getting a higher real wage. But you can show, I'm not going to do it now because that really would be too much maths, that the job creation condition shifts out by more than the wage curve, with the result that the productivity shock leads to a large rise in real wages and not much change in labour market tightness. Unfortunately, in the data, we see the reverse. We see lots of movement in labour market tightness, not so much movement in real wages. And this problem, if you like, with the standard search and matching model, the first is called the Scheimer critique. Robert Scheimer drew attention to this problem in a very famous paper. Now, there were other people who actually knew about that problem and had written on it. But it was Scheimer's paper that really brought it into the mainstream of economic thinking. And the Scheimer paper then spawned a huge literature. One paper of which, Christoffel et al., involves 7 authors. I'm one of them. And we discussed a number of potential solutions to the problem. Basically, Robert Scheimer said, here's a problem. And then tons of authors came up with ways of solving the problem. And here are some of them. You could imagine that it's really valuable, or you get a lot of utility out of being unemployed. That would solve the problem. Whether that's true or not is up for debate. Anyway, Hagedorn and Manofsky is the paper, for those who are interested. You can, of course, make wages sticky for incumbent workers. That actually doesn't do that much. If you make wages sticky for newly hired workers, you solve the problem. The problem there is that in the data, wages are much more flexible, or seem to be much more flexible, for newly hired workers than they are for incumbent workers. Although I should say there is actually quite a bit of debate about that. Alternatively, you can play around with the costs of hiring workers. It costs money to post vacancies, but it may be that there are increasing returns to posting more vacancies, or decreasing returns to posting more vacancies in terms of the cost of posting them. That can help solve the problem as well. Again, I have a paper on that, but the Fujita-Ramey one is probably the better known reference, I should say. You can have right to manage bargaining over hours. You can have firm-specific labor. You can have on-the-job search. All of these things help solve the problem. The one that I think is the way that the macro literature has gone is setting up what are called alternating offers. So the idea here is the following. The problem why the wage curve doesn't move much in the standard search and matching model is because wages are, when firms and workers bargain over wages, the outside option, what happens if the bargain doesn't work, is that the firm and worker just separate. So the outside option to the worker is the value of being unemployed. Now, in reality, when firms and workers bargain, as we've seen in the railways and in the health service in this country for the past year, firms and workers don't separate. What they do is they either have industrial disputes or strikes or whatever, or they just go on, they just keep bargaining. But the point is that the relationship stays there. The firm and worker relationship stays while the bargaining is ongoing. So when you're thinking about the outside option, so when firms and workers can't agree, what happens? Well, what happens is they have what they have currently. Now, if you introduce that into a search and matching model, you do solve the Scheimer critique. And more recent macroeconomic models, such as Cristiano et al. 2016, they have this alternating offer setup. Okay, that's enough theory. I suspect I've bored everyone, so I'm going to try and bring it back to actually what's going on in the UK labour market. And I'm going to start by talking about what happened to the UK labour market after COVID. So this is just the unemployment rate. Now, before COVID, the unemployment rate was 3.9%. It was down here. During COVID, it rose to 5.3%. It's now back at 3.8. Now you'll see that's actually a really small rise in unemployment, really small relative to some rises we've seen in the past. This is the rise in the global financial crisis from around about 5.5 to around about 9. And here is the one that I mentioned earlier, from around about 5 or so in the late 70s, pretty quickly up to 12% by 1983-4. So those rises in the past were a lot worse than COVID. And incidentally, if you look at what happened in the States, they saw a pretty sharp increase in unemployment there, which we didn't have in the UK. Now, there's an obvious reason why that didn't happen in the UK. We had the furlough scheme. The furlough scheme enabled firms to hang on to workers, so they weren't unemployed as such. They just weren't actually working, but they were remaining connected to the firm. That's the key thing here. So we did a little exercise where we asked what we thought might happen if the furlough scheme hadn't been in place. Now, I should say this is the employment rate, not the unemployment rate. So it's the percentage of the total labor force, percentage of the total working age population that is employed. Okay, but it makes the same point. And what we found in our modeling approach was that we had a counterfactual where the employment rate actually fell by 6 percentage points as a result of COVID. So that is a very hefty fall in the employment rate. What actually happened in the data was the employment rate only fell by 2 percentage points. And then, of course, recovered. Well, actually, indeed, hasn't really recovered to where it was beforehand. Now, of course, this is there is an interesting question about this, the employment rate, because there are some issues around the way it's measured in the data currently. And indeed, using alternative measures, the recovery, you can see a recovery to something that looks more like pre-COVID. But in the LFS data, the employment rate has not recovered. But the point, again, is that fall would have been much worse had it not been for the furlough scheme. Okay, what about the vacancy to unemployment ratio? I mentioned this is the key variable, if you like, in search and matching theory. What happened in the data? Well, we saw a dramatic loosening of the labor market in COVID. This is the same thing happening again. So the unemployment rate didn't really go up by that much, but nobody was hiring. Vacancies fell very dramatically. So the vacancy to unemployment ratio fell dramatically. And then, of course, we saw the reverse. As soon as we were out of COVID, firms wanted to hire. And the vacancy rate to unemployment ratio more or less got up to 1. In other words, there was 1 vacant job for every unemployed worker. In the classical economist world, everybody should have been working. But of course, in the real world, because of these labor methods, these search and matching frictions, we still have unemployed workers. We have unemployed workers, we have vacant jobs, because you literally cannot match them instantaneously. Okay, since 2022, the labor market has been loosening, but it remains tight. I mean, this is the vacancy unemployment ratio in the final quarter of last year. It's still well above any point it's been, at least since the change in the vacancy data in 2001. We can see that in the Beveridge curve. So remember, this was where we were pre-COVID. We then saw a massive drop-off in vacancy posting. We saw a little bit of a rise in unemployment in COVID. And then unemployment has fallen as vacancies have continued to rise. So this sort of straight line, if you like, is suggestive that there really is a kind of almost a minimal level of unemployment at which, you know, firms can post and post vacancies or not post vacancies with very little impact on the unemployment rate. But here's a real thing. The labor market is very tight in terms of what search and matching theory tells you matters. And as a result of that, you would expect to see high wage growth, and we'll come to that in a minute. But if you were just looking at the unemployment rate wasn't falling, you wouldn't necessarily have expected to see a rise in wage growth. But if you look at the right variable, vacancy to unemployment ratio, the one that's suggested by search and matching theory, then you saw a tight labor market. And the result of a tight labor market, you can see in this diagram here, is higher real wages. Now, that higher real wages we didn't see immediately. We didn't see in 2022 when the labor market was very tight. Why not? Because suddenly we were hit by a massive surprise inflation. Inflation rose from 2% to over 10%. And it did it very quickly. And of course, it takes time for wages to catch up. So we saw a fall in real wages initially, but more recently, we're beginning to see rises in real wages as real wages catch up. And this can explain why we've seen persistently high nominal wage growth. And again, today's data, nominal wage growth, total earnings, growth in total earnings, still 5.6% annually, which is pretty high. But the big labor market thing that happened post-COVID has been the rise in inactivity. And that in itself has been dominated by long-term sickness. You can see these pink bars. Since COVID started, we have an extra 750,000 people long-term sick relative to where we were pre-COVID. That's a large increase in inactivity resulting just from that one thing, from long-term sickness. And that is an issue for the labor market now. Okay, what about going forward? Where do I think we're going? The participation rate, well, we expect this higher inactivity rate to persist into the future. We don't see any particular reason why these long-term sick will suddenly return to the labor market. We are going to have to wait for that cohort to move beyond retirement age before we see any pickup in participation, we think. The other thing to note, though, is if I were to plot the participation rate out of the entire population, this is the number of people in the labor market divided by the total population, that line will be falling. And it will be falling because the retirement age population is increasing relative to the working age population. And people beyond retirement age are less likely to be in the labor force. So that's an issue, of course. Now, over recent time, that has been made up to a very large degree by immigration. The big question, I guess, for the labor market looking forward is, will that immigration continue? And I guess the answer to that question will be given by Jonathan at the next talk. So I'm going to leave that one for that. What about the unemployment rate itself? We think it's going to gently increase to 5%. 5% is our best guess of the natural rate. Remember, we have that formula. Unemployment inflows equal unemployment outflows. And we think that gives you an unemployment rate of 5%. Unemployment rate currently, 3.9, is still below that. We think it'll gently rise to that 5%. And the final thing on wages, I mean, I mentioned this persistently high wage growth. Trying to get my arrow here. It's had to stay persistently high because, of course, the inflation shock meant that real wages were falling over that entire period. So it's only recently that real wages have started increasing, but we expect them to continue increasing moving forward. And again, nominal wage growth high for a while, but then we think it will come down to a sort of a level more compatible with 2% inflation. And that's everything I had to say. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was really, really insightful. And I've got a few questions of myself actually. But before I go straight into those, if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, please do type them into the Q&A section and I'll pass them on. Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on the point, the evidence from the beverage curve over the last few years. What is the barrier then for unemployment falling below that level then? I guess can there be any strategies to alter where that level lies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I mean, the curve seems to suggest that it really is a hard barrier. And where does it come from? It comes from the fact that just it is literally a case of taking time. I put a vacancy up today, it's still going to take me a month. Even if the perfect applicant is out there, they've still got to apply. I've still got to go through the process. It's still going to take a month. There will also, on the other side, if I lose my job today, I may not necessarily want to walk straight into a job tomorrow. I may want to, take a week or two. Even if I have a job lined up, I may want to take a week or two off. That will be, I'd be counting it as being unemployed for those 2 weeks. So I think this really is what I guess is often called frictional unemployment. It's the frictions are such that there's always going to be at least this level of an unemployed workers, and the fact that we sort of managed to hit that bar actually is testimony to how well we've been doing in terms of job creation of late. The other thing I should say though is that has been compatible with a very tight labour market. There's a big, strong demand for workers that we don't seem to be able to fill at the minute, and a large part of that, I mean, there are two big reasons for that. One is the inactivity that I mentioned, so the large increase in long-term sick in particular. 750,000 extra workers out of the labour force. That makes a big difference. And then the other thing is, of course, at least initially, was the difficulty in filling jobs that were traditionally filled by short-term migrants from continental Europe. So the combination of COVID and Brexit meant that those workers went back to Europe. Okay, a lot of them have now come back, and workers are coming from all over the world, and Jonathan will talk about that next time. But it's taken time to sort of repair that, if you like, migration thing. So again, so the total labour supply has been of late has fallen quite a bit, and that means that even though unemployment is down as low as perhaps we can push it, firms have still been crying out for more.
Okay. Oh, thank you. All right, we've got a few questions that have come in. I'll start with the first one here. This one says that there are GPs that are unemployed and want to work as GPs, but they are unemployed because the government refuses to supply the NHS with the budget to employ these GPs. How does that link in with the stuff that you've been talking about today? This one asks.
Yeah, so the easiest way of thinking about what I've been talking about is that it is as a model of the private sector. The public sector works very differently, and the constraint on public sector wages and public sector employment is entirely public sector spending. I mean, I could have talked about the differences between public sector wages and private sector wages over the past few years, which has been quite interesting. But the bottom line is that for a long time now, the government has failed to invest in health and social care. It's failed to invest in education. The result is that the money is just not there in the health service at the moment to employ workers. Now, I would say, and indeed NIESR has argued quite extensively for increases in public investment, and I think investment in health and social care is particularly important. And in a way, that lack of investment, the lack of doctors, the nurses, hospital beds, etc. We're seeing that in rising waiting times, and it's not that big a leap to suggest that this has contributed to that rise in long-term sickness that we've been seeing. Obviously, COVID and long COVID was a lot to do with that. Mm. But my worry is that increase in long-term sickness is a real sign that there's a real problem with the health service now.
Yeah, and on that point, do you think that rise that we've seen in long-term sickness, do you think, I guess by the things that you've just said now, by potentially kind of reversing those spending decisions, maybe putting more money into the NHS, for instance, do you think that is something that could possibly start to reverse that trend we've seen in that?
Well, I think for the particular cohort that are aged 55 to 65 now, I think it's the issue really is about treating them. Well, the issue is about treating them. It's not clear that we could necessarily actually get them back in the labour force. But my worry is if we don't invest in the health service, that they'll be the next cohort will have the same problem that because they can't get treated as quickly, they'll get less healthier by the time they're treated, at which point it might not be possible to get them back into the labour force. I'm thinking of delays in, for instance, cancer diagnoses, delays in treating musculoskeletal problems, where if you treat them immediately, you can quite often solve the issue and get the person back in the labour force. Whereas if you let it go too long, then it gets much harder to get people back in the labour force. So I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying, I think the current generation of long-term sick, I think, I want to see the funding restored to the NHS so they can be treated, but I think it's possibly too late to get them back in the labour force. But if you don't invest in the health service, you're going to have another cohort and another cohort, and that problem's going to remain.
Yeah, I'll get you. Okay, thank you. All right, this person sent in a few questions. I'm going to deal with the first one and hopefully come back to the rest of them later on, so I can get through some other questions as well. But their first question is, artificial intelligence has been in the news a lot recently. Do you have any opinions on whether it will be positive or negative for the labour market, especially with regards to generative AI?
Well, that is a really good question. I think the answer is it could be really positive. It could, like a technological advance in the past, it will improve productivity no end. It could give people the opportunity to move into sort of more, challenging and enjoyable work rather than doing mundane report writing, for instance. I mean, there's report writing that's really interesting, but there's report writing which could be done by ChatGPT, and really I'd much rather they were doing it. But equally, the technology could have bad consequences. It could put a lot of people out of work if we don't use it in a sensible way. If we use it as a kind of a substitute for labor rather than as a complement, then that could be a bad thing. I mean, and this is true of any technology. I'm an optimist. And I'm an optimist because through history, we've had we've had new technologies and new technologies and new technologies, and actually the unemployment rate has not really changed much over 200 years. It's gone up, it's gone down, and when the technology is introduced, quite often there's a big shock to unemployment in a particular generation. But in general, technological progress has not been associated with fewer jobs. We've just invented new jobs. So I'm an optimist, but I think we're going to have to be careful about the way we introduce AI, and I think there's some policy decisions to be made which would help make it a more of a positive thing than a negative thing. I say policy decisions. I think it's decisions within firms as well.
Thanks. Okay, another question here. Would a change in the student profile at the university potentially significantly affect the unemployment rate? And they go on to say that participation at the university has increased to nearly 40%, but there are debates over the costs and benefits of it.
I mean, as you participate in university, you're out of the labour force. So increases in student numbers does not affect the unemployment rate as such. I guess the big question really is whether there are decreasing returns to university. So the argument would be, have we reached a point where we're sending too many people to university? Or alternatively, we're sending people who are doing the kind of the wrong things in a way. I mean, we have advances in particular technologies that we need people trained up in the ability to use these technologies. Are they getting that training in universities? Would they be better getting that training on the job? I mean, there are big questions about big questions, which I don't really have a good answer to, except suffice to say that there is something wrong with our ability to produce a skilled workforce at the minute. Despite the fact that we send a lot of people to university, we still, compared to other countries, our workforce on average is less skilled. Certainly the jobs that people do are less skilled. So something's not quite right there. And there is something about skills and training that as I said, we're not getting quite right. Our universities can definitely be part of the solution. And our universities, are a great source of export earnings. They're widely respected all over the world, and lots of foreign students come to them. So the universities are obviously doing something right, but as a nation, somehow or other, there's something that we're not doing quite right with skills and training that we need to address. The other thing I think we need to address is with people living longer and being more able to work later in life, there's an issue about the model of you go to school and university, you then work, you then retire, that I think is going to be less relevant in the future. I think people are going to be more inclined to want to sort of change career paths, may well need to change career paths mid-career. And there will be a need to provide training of some description for people of all ages. I think currently we're very good at providing training for people who are aged under 25. We're not so good at providing training for people who are in their 40s. So I think that's another thing we're going to have to address. As people are going to be working longer, they are going to want to spend time mid-career more often training up.
Oh, interesting. Okay, moving on then. What is the impact of inflation uncertainty and inflation volatility on inflation expectations and real wages, and wage expectations and hence wages? Sorry, it's a bit of a handful.
Yeah, so inflation volatility and inflation uncertainty. I mean, the effect in the labour market is going to be pretty similar to the effect in product markets. Is the more volatility you have, the more uncertainty you have, the more you want to guard against it. And the way to guard against it is to bargain for higher nominal wages. So you would expect to see higher nominal wage increases in a world with more inflation uncertainty. And of course, that in and of itself would lead to higher inflation. And you could get yourself very quickly into a real negative feedback loop with wage inflation going higher and price inflation going higher and more volatility and more uncertainty and higher wage inflation and stuff. I think this is why it's really important that the Bank of England does its job of keeping inflation low and stable.
Yeah. Here's another interesting question, kind of about something that you briefly touched upon as well. Obviously, there have been issues with the ONS gathering its unemployment data. And this person asks, is the unemployment figure itself reliable in your view? And you mentioned friction, also reticence of professionals over 50s to register as unemployed. They may even misreport why they aren't working.
Yeah, I mean, so there are two aspects of that. So one is the current labour force survey data is, I mean, the ONS are working really hard to solve the issue. I mean, the issue is that people are just less inclined to fill in surveys these days. And, you know, that's a real issue because, you know, to get reliable data, you need a large number of people answering the survey. So the ONS are working hard to make it easier for people to fill in the survey. And they're working very hard to sort of check the results that they're getting more thoroughly in order to be able to attach more confidence to the numbers. Do I think the current unemployment number of 3.9% is wrong? I suspect it's roughly there or thereabouts. The bottom line is unemployment is quite low, certainly by historical standards. And I think that's clearly true. What I see around me in terms of firms struggling to recruit suggests that, yeah, unemployment is quite low at the minute. There's a wider issue, of course, as to what you're trying to measure with unemployment, with the unemployment rate. I touched on that a little bit. How do you cope with people who want to work more, or indeed want to work less, but for whatever reason are unable to? So underemployment or people working more hours than they ideally would want. And then, of course, people who are out of the labour force, but if you were to offer them a job, would come back and take it. You know, someone mentioned retired doctors earlier, and they'd be an example of that. So there are issues around how we measure unemployment that mean you know there probably is a bit more labour supply out there than we actually measure anyway. What the answer is to that, well, is to use other measures, wider measures, I guess. There are some that are out there. The Americans, I think, have about 5 different measures they call U2 or U8 or things like that, which we can have a look at, and we do. But the bottom line, the picture still looks the same. It's that, you know, right now unemployment is pretty low. People are able to get jobs within reasonable periods of time. And that's a good position to be in. I hope we stay there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another one here then. What do you think are some useful avenues for search and matching research in the post-COVID world? And this person has a few suggestions: endogenous labour force participation, extending the framework to include furlough or short-term work schemes if these are to remain a potential policy response in the future.
They're both very good suggestions. I mean, actually, the first one was the one I was going to go for, so I'm going to have to think of a new one. I mean, just really understanding wage setting, I think, still remains the weak spot in a way. I mean, we have these bargaining models for wage setting, conditional on the frictions, conditional on the surplus that results from the frictions. But I still don't think that we really quite understand how wages are actually set. and why are they sticky? Why do they not move around too much? I mean, there are ways of thinking about that people are investigating, as I said earlier, but that's one area. In terms of the matching frictions themselves, I mean, we sum it all up in a matching function that just says vacant. We have so many vacancies, we have so many unemployed. Then you get so many matches. Trying to dig down deeper into that, maybe disaggregating matching functions by sector, by region, trying to really understand the matching process. How long does it take? How much does it cost? What resources are expended in matching up vacancies and unemployed workers? One more thing which people have looked at but never really run with is the idea of whether matching functions themselves are constant returns to scale or not. And one particular aspect of that is what's called stock flow matching. So the idea is that I'm a newly unemployed worker. I get to see all of the vacancies that are out there pretty quickly. But then once I've seen all of those, and if I still remain unmatched, my only chance of matching is going to be with a new vacancy which comes along. So the stock of unemployed workers are really matching with flow of new vacancies rather than stock of existing vacancies. So a couple of people have looked at that a little bit, but it hasn't really caught on. But I suspect it has implications which certainly would be worth exploring. So those are a few suggestions from me as to where the literature might be going. But to be honest, I haven't been working on this particular literature in a few years now, so I suspect I might be a little bit behind.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, and another one here. This person just wants to know how exactly you kind of model this matching function using econometrics. I'm sure there's plenty of detail that you might be able to go.
I mean, the quick answer is you just regress the number of matches in a given time period on the stock of vacancies and the stock of unemployed workers at the beginning of the period, and see what you get. And actually, what you get is something fairly close to constant returns to scale. I don't think you can reject that. I mean, people have estimated these things in the past. I mean, I'm thinking in particular, Aaron Yashif has spent a lot of time estimating these things. In the UK, Barbara Petrongolo, I know, wrote a paper quite a few years ago. Other people, I'm not sure what's been done on it more recently. Whether we have an up-to-date estimated matching function or not. I believe that there is some internal work at the Bank of England which has looked at that. But yeah, I mean, that's the simplest way of doing it. I guess the complication comes from how exactly you measure vacancies, how exactly you measure unemployment, whether you want to disaggregate, have a look at regional or sectoral matching functions. What is the right labour market as well? That's the other thing I didn't really touch on. So for certain jobs in particular, academic positions is a good example of that. The labour market is pretty international. And so a matching function with just domestic UK unemployed and domestic UK vacancies might not be the right thing.
Okay, makes sense. Well, great. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate that and all your answers to our questions in the Q&A session as well. And thank you very much to everybody else who's joined on this webinar this evening. But from all of us at the ERC, Stephen, many, many thanks, and I wish you a lovely evening.
Been an absolute pleasure. Thanks again, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks very much. Take care.